This call came in at 3:14 in the morning. A young woman, barely able to speak. There was someone in her dorm room, she said. A man, standing at the end of her bed. Her roommate was screaming so loudly you could hear it bleeding through the phone. The second call came in at 3:14 as well. A different building across campus. A young man this time trying to keep his voice level. His roommate wouldn't stop shaking, pointing at the same corner, saying a guy from one of his lectures was standing there, watching. He checked the whole suite. The door was bolted from the inside. The windows were sealed. There was nobody there, but his roommate kept pointing. And then a third call, a resident advisor, her voice coming apart. Same clothes every night, the student had said. Same man. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He'd been coming for 3 nights, and she told the girl it was just exam nerves. Just a bad dream. She doesn't believe that anymore. In every call, the same description. A man, college age. Same dark jacket, same lanyard around his neck. Standing perfectly still at the foot of the bed. Never speaking, never moving, and never, not once, blinking. And every time when help arrived and the lights came on, he was already gone. No open windows, no forced locks, no footprints, not in the carpet, not in the dew on the lawn outside. Nothing at all. The reports called it mass hysteria. Stressed students at a high-pressure school, frightening one another with a story that spread through the dorms. That's the comfortable explanation, the one that lets you sleep. But sit with a different question for a moment. A harder one. What if hundreds of students weren't imagining the same nightmare? What if they were all describing the same man? To understand what happened, you have to meet a young man named Daniel. Daniel was 20. Ordinary in every way that mattered. Quiet, easygoing. The kind of student professors remembered fondly without quite knowing why. There was nothing that marked him out. Nothing that should have made him the one. That spring, his father's elderly aunt died. She'd lived her whole life in a remote mountain village, a place so far from anywhere the roads gave out before you reached it. Daniel's father had barely known her, but family was family, so they went, all of them. The funeral was the first thing that felt wrong. Nobody cried. The villagers stood in silent rows, faces still as stone. And none of them would look at the coffin. They kept their eyes on the floor, on their hands. When they passed the plain wooden box, they turned their bodies away, the way you'd step around something on the ground you didn't want to touch. And there was the priest, very old, his voice shaking. At the end of every passage, he lifted his head and repeated the same warning, over and over, until it stopped sounding like a sermon and started sounding like a plea. Whatever happens, he said, do not look inside. The adults obeyed. Daniel watched them obey. But there's a thing that lives in all of us, no matter how old we get. A small, bright spark of why. Tell a grown man not to look inside a box. Tell him so fearfully, so many times, and something in him begins to lean toward it. So he waited. He watched the mourners file out toward the burial. He watched the old priest turn his back to light the candles. And when no one was looking, when, for just a moment, he was alone with it, Daniel walked to the coffin and lifted the lid. Just an inch, just enough to see inside. The corpse opened its eyes. Not the dull, sunken eyes of the dead. They were wet, aware. They rolled in that still face and found him, and fixed on him with a terrible, patient interest. Daniel couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The dead woman's lips parted, and in a voice like dry leaves dragged across stone, she spoke. For words, only for him. Now I know your face. The lid slipped from his fingers and fell shut. When he looked up, gasping, nobody had noticed. No one else had seen the eyes open. No one else had heard the voice. Only Daniel. He told himself he'd imagined it. On the long drive back to campus, he told himself again and again, until he almost believed it. For a little while, everything went back to normal. First, the changes were small, so small you could explain each one away. Daniel started laughing at empty corners. A soft little laugh, the kind you make when someone tells a joke only you can hear. His roommate would ask what was funny, and he'd look up like he'd forgotten anyone else was in the room. Then he began answering questions before anyone asked them. The right answer every time, as if he'd already heard it spoken somewhere else. He knew things too, a secret his roommate had never told a soul. The name of a girl who'd broken a friend's heart years before they'd ever met. He'd say these things plainly, without cruelty. And when they asked how he knew, he'd only smile and say, "He told me." His roommate's dog wouldn't go near Daniel's side of the room anymore. It would stop dead at the invisible line down the middle of the floor, hackles up, a low sound building in its throat. Nothing could coax it across. And every clock began to stop at the same time. The microwave, the alarm by the bed, the watch on the desk. Everyone frozen at exactly 3:13 in the morning. He'd reset them. By the next night, they'd stopped again. 3:13. Always 3:13. Then came the night his roommate woke for no reason at all. The room was silent, the lights off. But something pulled him up out of sleep, and he rolled over, and there was Daniel, standing perfectly still, in the middle of the room, facing the wall, his eyes wide open, fixed on the blank plaster a few inches from his face. He wasn't breathing the way a sleeping person breathes. He was simply standing there, in the dark, staring at nothing. His roommate whispered his name. He didn't turn around, but in a quiet, even voice, a voice that was his and somehow wasn't, he said, "He doesn't like when you watch me." The roommate's whole body went cold. He looked behind him, into the corner by the door. Nobody was there. And when he turned back, Daniel was gone. He found him in his bed, under the covers, fast asleep, as if he had never moved at all. That was the night his roommate started sleeping with the lamp on. It didn't help. In the lecture halls, there was nothing wrong with Daniel at all. He sat in his usual seat. He answered when called on. The instructors who'd liked him still liked him. The wrongness didn't show in the daylight. Came at night. It started with one student. A girl in Daniel's seminar woke her roommate screaming. She'd had a dream, so real she could still feel it, that a man was standing beside her bed in the dark, watching her. She knew him. It was Daniel from class. He hadn't spoken, hadn't moved. He'd only watched her sleep with that blank, patient stare. Her friends told her it was just a nightmare. Finals were close. Everyone was on edge. Until the next morning, when someone 2 floors up told the same story. And then another. Within 2 weeks, it was dozens of them. Students from every department, people who barely knew Daniel, people who'd never spoken a word to him, all describing the exact same dream. The man beside the bed, the dark jacket, the blank face, the eyes that never blinked. And every night, the dream changed in one small, terrible way. He stood a little closer. The first night at the door. The next, halfway across the room. Then beside the bed. Then leaning over it. Students stopped wanting to sleep, staying up till dawn in the library, weeping when the lights went out. Because the closer he came, the more real he felt. And they understood, the way you understand things in dreams, that something was going to happen when he finally reached them. Then the dreams stopped staying dreams. Students began waking up, truly waking, fully aware, and finding that he was still there, standing in the dark, watching. They'd scream, and people would come pounding on the door, and in the half-second it took to reach the light switch, he was gone. Empty room, bolted door, no footprints, just a sobbing student pointing at a corner where, a moment before, a man had stood. The university looked for reasons. The doctors blamed stress. The counselors had a tidier word, mass hysteria. One frightened student, they said, and a story that spread dorm to dorm until the whole campus talked itself into the same fear. It had happened before. It would pass. But it didn't pass. It grew. The lecture halls filled with hollow-eyed students who couldn't stay awake. Heads dropping onto desks, too exhausted to think, too frightened to sleep. They flinched at dark stairwells. They wouldn't walk back to the dorms alone. Then the empty seats started appearing. First a few, then whole rows. Some packed up and went home mid-semester. And the fear didn't stay inside the campus gates. It moved from the students to their families, from the families to the town. People double-checked locks that had never been unlocked. They sat awake in the dark, listening. In a matter of weeks, the whole town was afraid of the dark. And not one of them had thought to ask the only question that mattered. Why Daniel? While the town searched for an explanation, two people already knew the truth. Daniel's parents. They'd brought him home once the calls from the school started, and the moment he was back under their roof, they understood. They had simply learned there was no one they could tell. Every night, at exactly 3:13, Daniel left his bed. But left isn't right. He didn't walk. They lay awake to catch him at it, night after night, and never once heard a footstep. He was in his bed, and then, between one breath and the next, he wasn't. He'd appear somewhere else in the house. The hallway, the kitchen, his back to the window, halfway up the staircase, where no grown man could climb without a sound. Always perfectly still, always facing away, and always, when they worked up the courage to look at his face, wearing the faintest smile. Not his smile, something older wearing his mouth. So they tried to get help. His mother went to a priest. She opened her mouth to explain, and the words wouldn't come. Not the way you forget what you meant to say. The words left her, dissolving the moment she reached for them. Like a dream the second you wake. She walked out, unable to remember why she'd gone in. His father tried a pastor in the next town. Same thing. He drove home with the truth screaming inside him, unable to push a single sentence past his teeth. So they got clever. They wouldn't speak it. They'd record it. His mother filmed herself on her phone, calmly, saying everything. The funeral, the coffin, the voice, the 3:13. She watched it back. It was all there, and felt the first flicker of hope in weeks. She saved it. She set the phone down. In the morning, the file was gone. Not in a trash folder. Gone. As though it had never existed. His father wrote it down instead. Pages of it, in his own careful hand, sealed in an envelope and hidden away. He checked it the next morning. The pages were blank. Clean white paper, as if the words had walked off the page in the night. That was when they understood. This thing didn't just live inside their son. It was guarding itself. Every road to the truth had been quietly, patiently closed. And then one priest believed them. He was older, and he didn't need them to find the words. He seemed to already know. He looked at Daniel once, across a room, and his face went pale and certain. He'd help, he said. He'd come back in the morning, and they would begin. He took his notebook home that night and wrote down what he'd seen. He never came back. They found him the next morning in his own bed. No wound, no struggle, no cause the doctors could name. His face frozen in an expression his housekeeper said she'd never forget. Eyes open, staring at the foot of the bed. His mouth caught between a word and a scream. His journal lay open on the nightstand. One final entry in handwriting that grew shakier with every letter. The man was standing beside my bed. And there it was. The thing Daniel's parents had been too frightened to say even to themselves. It wasn't only that something had crawled inside their son and made a home there. It was that the thing would not allow itself to be found. It silenced every voice. It erased every word. And anyone who came too close, anyone who understood, who wrote it down, who meant to drag it into the light, could reach them too. wherever they slept. Daniel's father couldn't speak the truth. He couldn't write it, so he did the only thing left to him. He went back to the mountain. He told no one. He drove through the night and climbed the last broken road on foot. The houses were dark. The people would not open their doors. But the old church still stood at the edge of the village, abandoned now, its priest long dead. The same priest who had begged them not to look inside. Beneath the floor he found the records, centuries of them, brittle pages in a language he half understood, kept by generation after generation of frightened men. And as he read, by candlelight, the truth assembled itself, worse than anything he'd let himself imagine. The funeral had never been about honoring the dead. The old woman in the coffin had not been a person to mourn. She had been a prison. For most of a century, that body had held something inside it. Something old, patient, that did not belong in the world. The villagers' silence, their turned faces, the priest's endless warning, none of it was grief. It was containment. They'd buried these jailers for generations, passing the thing from one body to the next, because there was no way to kill it. There was only the looking. That was the lock on the cell. Anyone who looked directly into its eyes became the next vessel. That was why the priest had pleaded, "Do not look inside." The dead woman's body had been failing, too far gone to hold it much longer, and they needed only to get her into the ground before it found new eyes to climb into. And a curious young man had lifted the lid. "Now I know your face." His father's hands shook as he turned to the last pages. Because the records didn't end with possession. Daniel was not possessed. Possession would have been mercy. A possessed body is still one body holding one thing. That was not what his son had become. Daniel had become a doorway. Every night between 3:13 and 3:33, the 20 minutes the clocks all froze to mark, the thing didn't merely move through Daniel's body. It crossed through him, out of its world and into ours, a little further each time. That was why he appeared in the hallway, the kitchen, the stairs. That was the door swinging open in the dark. And the nightmares, the man beside the bed drawing closer every night. Those weren't attacks. They were invitations. Every student who saw Daniel beside their bed was being marked, chosen, touched by the thing on the other side of the door, one by one, night after night, the way you light a row of candles from a single flame. The fear spreading through the campus wasn't a side effect. It was the plan. And then his father read the final line, the one the villagers had underlined, again and again, until the ink tore the page. Once enough were marked. Once the flame had spread far enough, the door would no longer need a doorway. It would no longer need Daniel. It would simply be here. And it had been getting closer every single night. When Daniel's father came down off that mountain, he and his wife made a decision. No more silence. No more erased recordings and blank pages. If the thing could stop one voice, they'd bring so many it couldn't stop them all. They called everyone. The police, 2 doctors, Daniel's professors, a dean, a pastor, a priest, anyone who would come. They gathered them into the house at once and stood in their living room and tried, finally together, to make someone understand. And Daniel came downstairs to meet them, calm, polite. He shook the officer's hand. He answered the doctor's questions in a soft, clear voice. He told his professor he hoped to be back in class soon. He was, in every visible way, an ordinary, decent young man. Tired, perhaps, a little pale, but exactly the person they all remembered. There was nothing wrong with him. Anyone could see that. And so they looked at the parents instead. At the mother who hadn't slept in weeks. At the father with the wild eyes and the impossible story about a mountain and a coffin and a door. They exchanged the glances that adults exchange. They spoke gently. They used words like grief and exhaustion and the strain this family has been under. And one by one they left. Every one of them, convinced they'd visited a frightened, broken household and a perfectly normal young man. That night, every person who had set foot in that house woke at exactly the same time. 3:13 in the morning. The officer woke in his bed, the doctors in theirs, the professor, the pastor, each pulled up out of sleep into the dark for no reason they could name. And at the foot of every bed in every separate house, across the whole sleeping town, stood Daniel, watching, the same blank patience, the same dark jacket, the same man impossibly in all of those rooms at once. And then, for the very first time, he smiled. He looked at each of them, opened his mouth, and in a voice like dry leaves dragged across stone, he whispered 4 words. "Now I know yours."